The Israeli Declaration of Independence consists of 664 carefully crafted words. Compare that, Yochai Maital says in his introduction to a podcast series from Israel Story about those who signed the Declaration, to the almost 8,000 words of the U.S. Constitution. Among those 664 words, the words Jewish and Israel are mentioned a combined 45 times. The word right is mentioned 8 times. The word homeland, 5 times. The story of how this document came about is remarkable. The British announced in April 1948 its intention of leaving Palestine in May 1948, several months earlier than it had previously been indicating. Ben-Gurion realized that there was a unique opportunity, but only 3 weeks to realize it. He quickly formed what would be called the National Committee. It was composed of 37 representatives from all walks of Jewish society in Israel. The Haredim, the Mizrahim, even the revisionists, his staunch rivals who had opposed the UN resolution that had everyone dancing horror in the streets a few months back, were given a seat at the table. Ben-Gurion turned to Pinchas Rosen, the sharpest legal mind in the group, and charged him with coming up with a first working draft. Rosen turned to a young lawyer he had heard of, Mordechai Beham, the sharpest legal mind in Tel Aviv, and charged him with the task. Mordechai Beham, having no one to delegate to, went home overburdened by the weight of history on his shoulders and couldn't sleep. He started by phoning a friend, an American rabbi turned dentures factory owner by the name of Harry Solomon Davidovitz. What they presented to Rosen as a first draft was written in English, inspired by the American Declaration of Independence, and it was only later translated into Hebrew. No one was satisfied with version 1. The secular socialists were revolted by its religious overtones. The Haredi factions thought it sounded Christian. In a room with 13 Jews, 14 opinions surfaced. The second draft fared a little bit better, but eventually Ben-Gurion realized that with time running out, he'd need to have a direct hand in shaping the declaration. References to the Torah and the Nevi'im, the prophets, were introduced, and this, he felt, would appease the religious factions. It also spoke to his own affinity for the Bible. Ben-Gurion decided to let God back in, but just a crack. At the very end of the document, he reintroduced Beham and Harry's original sign-off, placing our trust in the Rock of Israel, we affix our signatures, it said. Rabbi Maimon and Sisling read over Ben-Gurion's amended proposition, and both were immediately up in arms. How can it be, wondered Maimon, that we are returning to our homeland after 2,000 years of exile and not mentioning God's name even once in thanks and recognition? What does God have anything to do with this? Retorted Sisling. We made this happen. We are declaring independence. Leave God out of it. He called the document religious coercion and vowed that he would refuse to sign. With only 1 day to go, Ben-Gurion shushed the 2 opposing politicians. Gentlemen, he bellowed. Each of us believes in Tzur Yisrael, the Rock of Israel, as he understands it. For you, Harav Maimon, Tzur Yisrael is the God of Israel. And for you, Mr. Sisling, it is the might of our people. Please, let's get on with it. On Friday morning, May 14th, 1948, Ben-Gurion sat in his home office looking over the text one last time. Reading sentence by sentence aloud, he practiced his delivery as he recited the 13th paragraph. The state of Israel will ensure complete equality to all its inhabitants irrespective of religion and race. Paula, his wife, who was listening from the other room, stopped him in his tracks. "And sex," she said. "Excuse me?" Ben-Gurion asked, annoyed at the interruption. "And sex? What about us?" Ben-Gurion told her he would try it out and see how it rolled off his tongue. "Sure, honey, that works." 1948, 1967. Hard-fought and seemingly miraculous moments that created a pride in our little state and a Jewish pride reborn out of the ashes of the Holocaust. Even the highly assimilated and progressive Jews of the United States, who saw America as our promised land, became more united in feeling a deep pride and a growing connection to the state of Israel. And we even see the shift in the declarative platforms that were updated periodically through to the late 1990s that stated what the core principles of Reform Judaism were, as we became unequivocal in our support of the state of Israel, especially by the late 1960s. And then, Yom Kippur, 1973. 50 years ago today. A high holy day season that goes down in Israeli history, and perhaps one of the worst moments for the Jewish people at that time since the Holocaust. We may remember it now as another miraculous victory by the Israeli army against enemies to our south and north who simultaneously attacked, aiming to take back lands that Israel had won in 1967. But Israel won at a terrible cost. Over 2,500 Israeli lives lost, over 8,000 injured, and 293 Israeli soldiers were taken captive. Their treatment at the hands of the Syrian and Egyptian forces were truly horrendous. Israel's lack of preparedness for this war, which caused them to initially see insignificant incursions into the Sinai Desert from Egypt and Syrian forces making it all the way to Tiberias, made Israel realize that they were not undefeatable. This was truly an existential battle. Sadat had publicly threatened war with Israel in a Newsweek interview back in April 1973. Several times during that year, the Arab armies conducted large-scale exercises, and each time Israel went on the highest alert levels for a few days. On September 25th, Jordan's King Hussein secretly visited Israel to warn Prime Minister Golda Meir that the Syrians were going to attack Israel and that Egypt would join in. And this was one of 11 warnings about war that Israel had received from legitimate sources. The lack of preparedness was seen as a sign of overconfidence and arrogance that ultimately brought down the Israeli government and led to the loss of the Labour Party at the next election. And something of a depression fell over the citizens of Israel as they tried to come to terms with what had happened. I'm too young to remember these events as they happened. But Jews around the world at the time held their breath and rallied to support Israel at their time of need. They were vocal and lobbying their governments, many of which were quite non-committal toward Israel. They raised money, they helped to provide aid and support. Even in Russia, Russian Jews seemed to understand what was happening and were in communication with each other and at great personal risk, were protesting the Russian government for its support of the Egyptian army. The realization that Israel did not have such a large assemblage of nation-state allies and was more at risk than had previously been realized was a wake-up call for many Jews and a cause for anxiety. The Yom Kippur War was the last time that Israel was attacked on multiple fronts in this kind of way. And despite the horrors of that war, it did lead to some negotiations and an eventual peace of sorts with Egypt. Israel, for a time, renewed its efforts to make peace rather than just waiting for the Arab countries surrounding it to come to their senses. 1973 was, in many ways, a moment of reckoning for Israel. Today, we find ourselves once again at a moment of reckoning for Israel. And while this moment is quite different to what happened on this day 50 years ago, the threat faced today is as existential and consequential as the Yom Kippur War, according to commentator and scholar Yossi Klein Halevi. Speaking recently in a webinar organized by the Times of Israel, Klein Halevi explained why he is sounding the alarm so urgently. Now, if you've read his writing or listened to him in the past, you'll know that he's a fairly center or maybe even center-right figure who's usually emphasizing the need for Jewish unity. He tries to draw out truths and wisdoms from multiple sides of an issue. And he's dedicated his career to this approach because he saw how, throughout our long history, the division of the Jewish people has been destructive. So what has changed for him now? He's witnessed how this current Israeli government has brought together corruption with zealotry, the same deadly mix that caused our downfall in ancient history, seen in the corruption of the priests and the extremism of zealots. And so, for the first time, he's really speaking out against the current government because of the profound danger he sees in this moment. Moti Friedman, a journalist, also spoke in the same webinar. He described how he had watched Lebanon fall apart from being somewhat of a democracy and a thriving place in the 1950s to then its splintering during the 80s and the 90s, and now being a place that deals with Hezbollah and many sectarian divisions. But he says it didn't occur to him in the late 90s when he was serving in the Israeli army there that this might happen in the future for Israel. 3 years ago, he acknowledged, he saw hints of it but didn't take it seriously. But he sees what happened over several decades in the 20th century in Lebanon starting to happen now in Israel. He sees the splintering and the breakdown of the institutions that are needed, the courts, the army, and so on. And he's calling for all hands on deck to counter this. For months now, over 7 million Israelis have taken to the streets to peacefully protest the current government of Israel. We see a largely secular crowd at the huge gatherings in Tel Aviv every Saturday night, but in Jerusalem and around the country in small towns all over the state, gatherings of a diverse and broad collective of Israelis are trying to make their voices heard. This current government actually represents 30,000 fewer votes than those who voted against the Netanyahu bloc. With so many political parties in Israel, governments are always formed by delicate coalitions, and until now they've largely understood the need to govern accordingly, maintaining a certain balance between the many voices and political perspectives found among the Israeli populace, much as Ben-Gurion had to do in order to get the agreement of 37 individuals who represented almost every flavor of Zionism in the signing of the Declaration of Independence. But something has changed. The poisonous mix of power, corruption, and religious extremism has given shape to a government that does not represent the will of the people. Daniel Gordis, a writer and teacher who has historically been quite damning of Jews in the diaspora who are critical of Israel without having any skin in the game, is now calling for us to make our voices heard. He says he is watching the most racist and corrupt government that Israel has ever seen, and a government that is speaking about annexing the entire West Bank and taking over private land owned by Palestinians, while spewing bigotry of all kinds. Klein Halevi issues a call to action for us, to you and me. Yes, he says, Israel's future will be decided by Israelis, by those who live there and who vote. But, he says, diaspora Jews can decide what they will or won't support. We have to ask ourselves, what Israel are we supporting? What does it mean to be a citizen of the Jewish people? And if we insist that Israel is the center point of Jewish life around the world today, then that imposes a certain amount of responsibility on Israel. It binds Israelis to make some space at the table for diaspora voices. And we have the right to criticize Israel and speak up when the Israel that we care about is taking a wrong turn. So what can we do? I don't preach love of Israel. Rather, as I have always done, I plead that we remain engaged with Israel, educated about Israel, paying attention, sending our support financially when we can to help support the grassroots organizations that are organizing the protests, choosing carefully who gets our Israel-bound donations. Support those who are leading the fight to preserve the identity of Israel as a democratic state that seeks to protect the rights of all of its citizens, regardless of race, religion, or sex, as stated in the Declaration of Independence. And when I send out links to this sermon after Yom Kippur, I'll provide a list of some of these organizations so that you can explore them further for yourself. But back to the declaration itself. While it did appear in earlier drafts, in the final document, the word democracy does not appear anywhere. Megillat Ha'atzmaut is widely referenced and quoted as the bedrock of Israeli democracy. But why? Writes Shlomo Maital, who happens to be my brother-in-law, in the Jerusalem Report, as he's reviewing these stories as told in the Israel Story podcast series. The truth is, he says, there isn't a clear answer. Only speculations. Some hypothesize that no one could agree on what the word democracy even meant. The signatories to the declaration were people with ideologies ranging from theocracy to communism. If Herzl himself had been given a say, he might have advocated a monarchy. How do you even begin to bridge those differences? You don't, he writes. You stay vague. You paint with broad strokes, sticking to generalities like freedom, justice, and equality. Nice-sounding words that are harder to measure on a yardstick, harder to be held accountable for. But others write this off as almost an oversight. The pre-state Jewish settlement, the old Yishuv, was so thoroughly democratic that any other system of governance was unthinkable. It seemed unnecessary to waste valuable real estate on the precious parchment by stating the obvious. The nascent nation would be a democratic one. It went without saying. So there isn't direct talk of elections or democracy or a parliament or a judicial system. When Ben-Gurion presented his colleagues with the final version, there was still some grumblings, but Ben-Gurion pressed on. He knew that time had run out. The big moment was nigh, and no one wanted to be remembered as the guy who, after 2,000 years, sabotaged the founding of the state. He calls for a vote, and the declaration is ratified unanimously. It is perhaps the last time the Jewish people agreed on anything in Israel. As one historian put it, the true miracle of Israel isn't that we managed to stave off the enemies around us, but that for a brief, fleeting moment, we came together and actually agreed on something. Today, I think we can also agree on something. Israel is in trouble. And if you care about the future of Israel and the future of the Jewish people, you cannot be a bystander. History will judge us on what we did or didn't do in this moment. Educate yourself on the issues. Speak up when there are opportunities to be heard. Choose to support Israeli organizations that stand for the Israel that you would be proud of. Im titzu enzo agada, in the words of Herzl, if we will it, it will be no dream.